All right, welcome to the Regs podcast. I am your host, Max, and today we'll be continuing, of course, our coverage of Alaskan fish species, and we're covering at the moment salmonids, so salmon, char, and trout. And then after that, I don't know what I'll be covering next as far as species goes, but there'll be a few episodes soon in between the species coverage, talking about the sort of social media scape, fishing guides in Alaska that have shitty practices as far as how they conduct themselves on the river along with other people, and even their crummy fishing practices just in general, as well as taking advantage of a lack of knowledge that their clients might have, and the whole reason that their clients are going fishing with them in the first place is because they don't know, so they're being taught crummy things. But that's for a later episode. Today we're going to be talking about probably the most popular sport fish on the fly in Alaska, and actually supposedly the most popular sport fish in the world, and they exist on every continent, believe it or not, except Antarctica, the rainbow trout. So, to start us off, rainbow trout they actually only populate about a third of the state. Their range is very, very small, believe it or not. I know, kind of mind-boggling to a lot of people who live in the southern regions of the state or the southeast. But most rainbow trout populations just never made it further north than the Alaska range. There are some isolated ones around Fairbanks and the Yukon River tributaries, but in those isolated lakes, they were put there artificially by human intervention. So they don't count as part of the native range of rainbow trout in the state. So, rainbow trout in the state or in the world commence spawning in the springtime. Okay, and these are like rainbow trout. I'm not getting to steelhead yet. That's a whole nother can of worms, but I'll talk about those guys here in a little bit. So rainbow trout spawn anywhere from late March to June, generally. And the incubation of their eggs, and they're very similar to salmon, where they'll dig out a red, they'll put their eggs in the ground, cover them back up with gravel and substrate. The eggs will develop and hatch after absorbing the right amount of thermal units. And rainbow trout eggs can develop very quickly. It can sometimes take weeks, or it could take as long as salmon do, where it's months over just a long period of time. And so, trying to get back on my train of thought, sorry. And so once they've hatched, just like the salmon for alvin, they move into the substrate where they continue to develop, turn into fry, and then they rise out of the gravel and substrate. And the planktonic blooms that occur either from the lake cycle, which the lake cycle is very simple. It just occurs as a longer process than it does for marine nutrients to be brought up into an environment like salmon bring up. The lake cycle is basically sunlight causes photosynthesis in the lake with phytoplankton. The phytoplankton get eaten by the zooplankton, and the phytoplankton are photosynthesizing along with other plants and vegetation in the lake. And then all that phytoplankton gets eaten by zooplankton and other insects, and then the insects feed smaller bait fish or just other fish in general, like grayling, stickleback, everything. And then eventually, of course, the predators eat those prey species, and the cycle continues over and over. And the predators die and spawn and reproduce, of course, or spawn and reproduce and then die. So sun, plants, photosynthesis, bugs, fish, bigger fish, essentially. It goes round and round, and it occurs actually over a longer period of time than you'd think. Usually it's constantly happening, but constantly in all stages of the cycle are constantly happening at once. But it's always happening over the summer periods, and even to a smaller degree in the winter periods. And this is one of the key features of a non-M.N.A. lake, like we discussed in one of the first episodes, because they have to rely on photosynthesis more than a lake that has marine nutrients brought up from the ocean to it. So anyways, rainbow trout is now fry. It's growing. And once they kind of hit smolt size, rainbow trout, of course, stop feeding on planktonic animals, start feeding on more insects. And here's the beautiful thing about rainbow trout. They are one of the most adaptive species of trout there are, if not the most. They can survive in very warm water. They can feed and live pelagically in lake systems as well as the ocean. They can live in small sloughs, rivers, streams. They can be really small depending on the amount of space they're given, or really huge. They're very diverse. They basically grow to the size and of the environment around them, like most fish do, but rainbow trout especially. And then they also adapt to the available food sources very quickly. So if there's salmon eggs or around, they're going to be feeding on those. They're going to very quickly learn to start sitting behind spawning salmon to pick up eggs. Eventually they'll figure out how to feed on the dead salmon flesh, and when there's no available salmon around, feed on smolt, insects, other rainbow trout, sculpin, etc. They're very adaptive. They figure it out very quickly, and most top predator species who are freshwater salmonids, like mostly freshwater salmonids, so like trouts and chars especially, not so much salmon, are incredibly adaptive to the food sources that are around them and very quickly learn how to feed on them effectively and grow and reproduce, of course. So some rainbow trout, and this is a whole combination of environmental factors as well as genetic factors that play into this, but generally the main trigger for a rainbow trout to move into the ocean and become a steelhead is a lack of food. So in a given system where a rainbow trout might find food, during the summer months, because like pink salmon, for instance, or just some kind of salmon species or lamprey are moving up and spawning, they might find little to no food and probably little to no oxygen in the environment they're in. So they need to go find food. They need to go find the oxygen. So a lot of times rainbow trout move around to go find those things and end up in the ocean. If it's not because of food or the environmental factors, it could simply be just because of genetics, where they feel the urge to migrate out just like salmon do. This has been an ongoing study for the last 50 years, so I don't have a straight answer. It's just a combination of things rather than just one big thing. But I am always going to back up the theory that it's environmental factors more so than genetic, because rainbow trout, and this is especially true for rainbow trout, and just Oncorhynchus micus, which is their scientific name, derivatives, they just move where the food is. So wherever the food is, they're going to go look for it. They're going to find it and they're going to feed. And so eventually when they head out to the ocean, a lot of times they'll do so during times of high water or storms or rain, just like the salmon do in the springtime when water's high from snowmelt. Some instances have been recorded where rainbow trout just straight up go to the ocean, whether or not there's a lot of food around or oxygen. It's, again, a lot of factors that play into it, a combination of genetics and just environmental factors altogether. But the rainbow trout who do go to the ocean and become steelhead are most recognized to go in the springtime when a lot of fish move out to the ocean. And I would speculate that those ones in particular are the ones that have more of a genetic factor playing into it than environmental factors. So rainbow trout do spawn multiple times. They do. It's very common. Steelhead trout are very well known to spawn multiple times. They don't die from it like salmon do. Not typically. They might. It does happen because of, but they are known to spawn more than once, if not more than twice, a lot of times. And so rainbow trout tend to do very well in this state purely because of the fact they have extreme quantities of marine nutrients and food coming up from the ocean, and then they also have food year-round from the offspring as well as other insects that might be living because of the planktonic blooms and the marine nutrients brought up from the ocean by these salmon. So when a rainbow trout, I completely lost my train of thought. Anyways, so rainbow trout do very well because they have a lot of marine nutrients coming up in the ocean. That's what I'm trying to get at. And because they're either feeding on salmon eggs or dead salmon or insects, a lot of the summer months, there's tons of food around. And then during the winter months, because all those dead salmon cause the planktonic bloom, there tends to be a lot of prey items around, whether it be insects or more dead salmon, or salmon smolt, salmon fry, other rainbow trout, just everything. They are very diverse in what they can eat and feed on. So they do very well as a result of the large amount of biomass coming up and fueling everything. In non-M.N.A. lakes, rainbow trout tend to do very well too because of how diverse they can be and what they'll eat. But the big difference between them is more often than not size and how many are in a given lake or environment. Generally, the rule of thumb for rainbow trout and how big they get in a lake that has no marine nutrients coming into it is the bigger the lake, the bigger the rainbow trout. Because the more nutrients that lake and prey that lake can support, the bigger those rainbow trout can get. But these lakes can, depending on how sparse the food web is, so if there's like only rainbow trout in a lake, it's not totally unheard of to discover that those rainbow trout have eaten so much of the terrestrial food sources or insects in that lake that there's now a lack of food and they're all stunted. And because because they're all of like a single generation, they're all of very similar size. So none of them can get big enough necessarily to feed on the smaller rainbow trout, so that there's now a prey item in the food or a predator in the food web that's around enough to feed on the prey so that the prey don't overpopulate and cause food crashes or biological crashes in the lakes, causing everything to become stunted and stalled in terms of the lake cycle. So a good example of this actually would be Symphony Lake by Eagle Lake in the Eagle River region, just north of Anchorage on the Glen Highway. And what happened with that is there were only Arctic grayling put in that lake, and all the Arctic grayling are now stunted because they're all of such similar size that, just like with the rainbow trout, none of them can get big enough to necessarily feed on smaller Arctic grayling enough to keep their population in check so that not all the insects and terrestrial foods are eaten. So that's why if you go fish that lake, you'll have a hard time finding any Arctic grayling bigger than maybe a foot. So that's why I'm a big contributor, or not contributor, but activist for, if you're going to add a prey item into a lake like that, you need to eventually add a predator species so things like this don't happen. And for Arctic grayling, I would 100% recommend either burbot or lake trout be added into that lake. I would especially like lake trout, because that would be something that would be more readily or just easily catchable than burbot during the summer months. Plus, who doesn't want to catch a big old lake trout, on a hike that they went on? Plus, it would be nice because people would be generally a little more discouraged from keeping those lake trout that keep everything else in check if they, have to hike them back if they want to keep them. Otherwise, the people that would be keeping them would be more the campers and whatnot. If you really want to keep the lake trout in check, however, the simple way to do that is to simply just add maybe a limit of one at let's say one. You can keep one annually. There's a size limit of no bigger than 18 inches, so you can only keep non-mature lake trout, just as an idea. But anyways, back to the rainbow trout thing, and the whole lake cycle and fish becoming stunted because there's not enough bigger predators around is not a totally common occurrence, and it normally occurs, at least in most of the instances I've seen it, when there's just simply not enough predators around. Because I have seen this happen where it's more of a matter of there just not enough space, simply. Like this one creek that I fished a couple of times is full of Arctic char, but these are dwarf Arctic char, purely because the stream, it's really long, it runs miles and miles and miles, but it's only like 30 feet wide at its widest point and maybe less than a foot deep. It's just not big enough and doesn't have simply a big enough volume of water to sustain all of these Arctic char, especially the little ones who only feed really on insects rather than other fish to keep themselves in check. So now that I've explained a little bit about rainbow trout, why they are fantastic because of the amount of foods that they can feed on, they do really well in the areas where they're native to. I've explained to you a little bit about their spawning. By the way, lake trout, or not lake trout, but rainbow trout tend to stage up for spawning as soon as ice is out. So that's always a fantastic time to go looking for them because they're hungry and mean and they need to collect as much energy as possible because it's time. It takes a lot of energy for them to spawn. So they're feeding, they're hungry, and it's a good time to go and catch them. But I'm a big advocate of making sure that the times you go fishing for them when it's their spawning season, the areas you are under catch and release status, not catch and keep. Because believe it or not, rainbow trout get very old in this state, upwards of 20 years in some cases. And the oldest recorded steelhead, for instance, is 11 years. But I guarantee you that a lot of those rainbow trout out there, that have been caught and found are definitely, a portion of them are definitely older than 20 years, or at least used to be before human intervention got into a mix and started gumming up the works. And because of this fact alone, that they get so old, they also mature a lot later in life, especially in non-M.N.A. lakes or drainages. You have to be very, very strict on regulations, especially as far as size goes, because you do not at all want to be taking away from the age group of mature fish. You want to be taking away from the age group of non-mature fish. And one of the big reasons for that is because the smaller fish almost always outcompete the bigger fish, either through sheer overwhelming numbers or the fact that they tend to be more voracious feeders. Not so much actually more voracious, but they're able to affect the food web because they tend to feed closer to the very bottom of the food web, where like if you want to effectively, what I'm getting at is if you want to effectively destroy a population of rainbow trout, for instance, you got to destroy it from the bottom up. So if I wanted to get rid of them, I don't necessarily have to just poison the lake or go after all the adult fish. I just have to slowly start making sure there's no planktonic blooms, or figure out some way to effectively blot out the sun for, X amount of time so no photosynthesis occurs. Because if you can destroy the bottom, you can destroy the top. And little fish are very good at doing that because they feed mostly on the bottom, closer to the organisms that, rely on photosynthesis to reproduce and contribute to the lake cycle. My point is, you have to keep more smaller fish than you do the bigger fish, because not only do the bigger fish reproduce the most offspring, it just takes them a long time to develop the organs and collect the biomass, especially in colder northern climates, to reproduce. So, for instance, a rainbow trout may take up to 5 years to reproduce, which is actually not a very extreme number compared to a lot of the other salmonid species in this state. Lake trout, it could be upwards of 12. Grayling, it could be even more than that. But rainbow trout are on the low end. Because of this, they tend to do, it's another reason why they tend to do very well. So they might not reach maturity until, 5 years of age. But that doesn't mean, of course, go ham on all the smaller fish. You still have to regulate that, of course. So the whole point is, keep smaller fish, release the bigger spawning fish. It's important because the bigger spawning fish, it takes them a long time to mature. It takes them a long time to collect enough biomass to even develop the organs required to spawn, like the eggs and the milk. And then once they spawn the first time, it may take them another 3 years, who knows, to spawn. In some instances, lake trout, for instance, only spawn once every 3 years, if not more than that. So rainbow trout are a lot of the same way. So this is why it's incredibly important to protect the big spawning population of fish in a given species or ecosystem, because they're the ones that maintain the fishery and keep systems healthy. And this is why a big reason the regulations in this state suck, because for one thing, it is in fishing culture, not so much fly fishing, but just fishing culture in general, you want the biggest fish. Bigger is always better to take home. But the problem with this is it's a good way to destroy a fishery as far as rainbow trout, grayling, lake trout, all those other freshwater species. It's a good way of effectively destroying them. This is one reason that led to a population crash of burbot way back last century, not just because of sheer overfishing, but because of the fact everybody wants to keep the big spawning, fish, the giant lunkers, the hogs, the chungus, the big ones. But it needs, that whole culture is really difficult to change, and it has to change if we're going to keep these fisheries sustainable. Because I'm telling you, as of right now, we're not helping it by keeping the regulations as loosey-goosey as they are. The only reason that they are, that the populations are where they're at right now is purely because of the fact that there's still enough of those big spawning groups of fish, probably because they got smart enough not to know what is food and what is a lure or a hook or where the people hang out, which is not good. That should not happen. And if that's happening, that's because the regulations need to change. Because, again, they suck. In other parts of the world, where fishing is a lot tougher, that's because of regulations, is generally because in those regions, the people have overfished their areas so much that it bit them in the ass and they lost their fishing for decades, if not longer. Because they overfished everything because regulations were, if not non-existent, too loosey-goosey, and they just completely destroyed everything. So, adding to general regulations, like there's general regulations for everything but what's listed under other finfish, which again, there needs to be at least some regulations for everything. Doesn't matter if it's commercially harvested or not. In the South Central, there's no regulations on whitefish, but there's tons of whitefish here. And they're getting absolutely destroyed. Like the Little Susitna River population of whitefish, because there's no regulation on them, you can keep as many as you want, and everybody knows when they spawn and where they stage. They're virtually, their population is virtually gone at this point. The ones that are still around, their population is on good authority, because I know people who guide on that river as well as live on it. They even tell me that the population of whitefish has seriously declined because of overfishing, because there's no regulations on them. It's completely appalling that nobody cares enough, because there's no money, just because there's no money behind whitefish in any way, that they're letting these fish get destroyed. So, along with the general regulations, there needs to be regulations on what size of fish you can keep. Because if you do that, you're not going to affect the people who are poachers, who disregard the law, who just don't care, or they think they're entitled to the resource, so they just take and take and take. The way you affect change is from the bottom up. So by affecting the people who do follow the regulations is how you slowly get the culture to change. And of course, you need to start now, or just sooner rather than later. And that's part of the reason I started this podcast, was to get people educated on how we can preserve these fish resources, as well as just treat the fish better. I don't really count myself as an animal activist by any means, but we can do better by a lot. So as far as the sport fishing, I'm going to transition away from the regulations. Life history on rainbow trout is very simple, but there's a lot of differential or dimorphism between behavior in a lot of streams with what rainbow trout do, how they live, and how they feed. And one more thing, for instance, stream X, because it's smaller, more shallow, versus stream B, which is deeper, wider. One fish in one stream might feed more on other fish in stream A, and even rodents like shrews and mice and even rats, versus stream B, which might feed almost exclusively on other insects because it's easier to find them and they're more plentiful in a larger system, versus stream A. So that's just an example, just based around the difference in the environment that these fish are living. They might feed very much differently. So, anyways, moving away from that, the sport fishing scene for rainbow trout in this state, I would argue, is one of the most healthy, because of the culture of fly fishing, and the culture of fly fishing evolved around trout, especially in the last 100 years or so. It was trout and salmon. Fly fishing initially started way back a million years ago at this point, in two places, and it mostly died out in one and then came back. Central Europe and then England, or at least the UK. And all of their fly fishing was centered around catching salmon. It was a gentleman's sport. And even at Buckingham Palace today, there's a stream that runs there where you can go fly fishing. To my knowledge, if you're rich enough, of course. I don't know totally on that. I'm sure you could probably go and do that if you wanted. But there are rules because it's a gentleman's sport. And you can catch 3 species of fish that I know of in there: Euro grayling, brown trout, and rainbow trout. And you have to stand downstream and you have to cast upstream, and you can only use dry flies and barbless hooks, because the challenge is with the limited way you're allowed to fish for these fish, and you're only allowed to catch and release, by the way. It's just a challenging sport or challenging thing to do. But the point is, because of that early on catch and release culture around gentlemen and the art of fly fishing, it's changed, of course, over the years, but that catch and release mentality towards trout has always stuck to some degree for the gentlemen of the fly fishing world and the sportsmen and conservationists in the fly fishing world. And rainbow trout are the pinnacle of catch and release. I would say no fish gets caught and released more in this state than any other, aside from maybe sculpin. So, of course, not everyone cares enough to catch and release rainbow trout. For instance, on one creek I used to fish a lot before it kind of went downhill because it just got too popular. I came down the stream one day, and there's this Texas fellow who bought some property around the stream down the road because there's kind of a neighborhood. He was fishing it, and I saw him coming back up, and it's a limit of 2 rainbow trout and 1 over 20 inches on that stream. And generally the people who fish this stream anyways just catch and release anyways for the rainbow trout. That stream is one of the biggest fly fishing streams I've ever seen in terms of what kind of people go there. They're all gentlemen, definitely, or at least a good portion of them. This fellow was not. He was, upon talking to him, somebody who moved from Texas and bought some property here. He didn't know, or at least played dumb, that the regulations or fishing regulations were even a thing in the region he was fishing, which of course they frickin' are. And he kept about 8 trout, the big spawning mature fish that take a long time to get to that point. The smallest was easily about only 18 inches, whereas the biggest was upwards of 25. And he had his 2 kids with him, and I was trying to explain to him that he can't, and I was being very polite about it because, again, some people just generally don't know, But upon talking to this individual, he clearly just did not care to know more than anything. But what ended up happening is the trooper who patrols on that highway, I've only ever had my license checked once, by a, law enforcement ever, as far as fishing. I just don't ever get intercepted that much. And the times I've talked to them, where I went fishing, I wasn't fishing, so they had no grounds to check my license and didn't ask at all. But this one knew I was kosher. I always have my license, and I talked to him a couple times. Cool guy. And I was up ahead of this Texan guy and his two kids. And I warned the trooper about this guy and all the fish he kept. He came back up the trail and sure enough got whacked with a nice fine and all his fish confiscated. And the trooper was nice enough, however, to give him a pair of regulations that he had on him. So the guy doesn't have any excuse anymore. At least he didn't that year, because this was like maybe even 5 years ago at this point. But I noticed this all because it takes me a while to kind of get out of my waders and all my gear and everything. So I was there to see what happened. I didn't glow. I try not to. I try to remain humble, especially with, fish and fishing that I do. But I couldn't help but think in my head, of course, good, freaking fine. Another one bites the dust. Anyways, so that's one big problem with people who move up to the state, is because fishing and fishing culture, as well as the subsistence and take culture of the state, is advertised and romanticized so much. People come up here with the mentality that they can just take whatever the hell they want, or at least a good portion of them do. Of course, not everybody does, and there are, of course, a lot of people who do abide by the regulations and follow everything and have a lot of respect for what's around here. On an off note, one of those groups of people who don't have a lot of respect around here are the people who only use the wildlife as a means to get themselves noticed. And this doesn't really bother me that much, because in a way I do it, but there is a particular group of people up here who do, and are absolutely the most horrible individuals. The word toxic comes up, where they only care to fish not because they really enjoy it, but just because they want to get well known because of it. And what I have to say to those people, yeah, you and about 50,000 other people in this state. But the nice thing about a lot of those sort of people is that a lot of them, despite having that I want to use this to get famous, do spread around some good fishing culture. There's a good example of this, but I'm not going to advertise them at all or give them a shout out, because they are not exactly very nice people, but they still do practice catch and release a lot, especially for species like lake trout, which do need more of a catch and release culture around them. But my whole point with this spiel is that for all fish in this state, a lot of them take a long time to get very old, or not. Oh, of course, yeah, it takes a while to get old, no dur, but my point is, it takes a long time for them to get mature. It takes a long time for them to develop the organs to spawn and continue to do that. And it's just, it needs to, the whole fishing culture needs to change around the fact that we need to have respect for the fish who've survived long enough to get to the point where they have earned to reproduce. Because the reason I have so much respect for a lot of the fish in this state is because they're older than I am. Kind of crazy to think. Okay, I may not sound that old, but I'm in my 20s. And it's kind of humbling catching something that's a decade older than you are, but only so small and just fits in one of your hands. And people don't realize this, and they see these fish and they just think, oh, bigger fish, more meat, I want to keep, and gets more attention on social media. For the very vast, for like the thousands upon thousands of fish I've caught, maybe less than even like 0.00001% of them have I ever even had the thought to take a picture of. Ever. A lot of them I just release. And that's that. But anyways, that was my little brief, very brief life history on rainbow trout. A brief spiel on how regulations need to change for them and why, but just regulations need to change overall for a lot of the freshwater species in the state. And some good, though, behind it, because I do, if I can, like to end on a good note. Because again, I'll reiterate, fishing culture or fly fishing culture is one of the best things in this state. Albeit it tends to be filled with snobs. I'll admit that. Oh yeah, full of snobs. They do have a good practice as far as catch and release goes and having respect for the fishing and the fish. So think about this. Hit me with some questions. Leave a comment if you would like me to cover or talk about a specific thing or have my opinion on it. I'll even give you a shout out because I like to give credit where credit's due. And I'm not sure what the next episode will be on. I'm probably going to cover, of course, another salmonid, family of the salmonid, but I'm not sure if it's going to be a char or the only other native trout species in this state. But stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you for listening, and leave a comment, like, and subscribe.